The wagon train had been moving west for 73 days when everything fell apart. Sarah Mitchell pressed her hand against the rough canvas cover, feeling the wind tear at the fabric like angry spirits. She was 19 years old, and this journey was supposed to be her fresh start. Her father had died of fever 2 weeks into the trek, leaving her alone with strangers who had their own families to protect. Now those strangers were running for their lives. The attack came without warning just after dawn. Sarah had been collecting water from a stream when the first shots rang out. She dropped her bucket and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. The camp erupted into chaos. Men grabbed rifles. Women screamed for their children. Horses broke free from their tethers, their eyes wild with terror. Sarah reached her wagon just as a bullet splintered the wood beside her head. She threw herself inside, covering her ears against the thunder of gunfire and war cries that split the morning air. Through a gap in the canvas, she watched the horror unfold. The Crow warriors moved like shadows across the prairie grass, their painted faces fierce and unforgiving. This was their land, and the wagon train had crossed it without permission. Sarah understood that now, though understanding brought no comfort. 3 wagons were already burning. The acrid smoke made her eyes water and her throat close. She could hear Mrs. Henderson crying for her husband, could see young Thomas Brady lying motionless in the dirt. Everything her father had promised about this journey, the land, the opportunity, the new life, was turning to ash. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the scene. Sarah remained frozen in her hiding spot, barely breathing. She heard boots crunching on gravel, heard voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Her hands shook so violently she had to clench them together. The wagon rocked slightly as someone climbed aboard. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, rough hands pulled her from her hiding place and dragged her into the sunlight. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and looked up to see 5 warriors standing over her. Their faces were hard, emotionless. One of them said something she couldn't comprehend, and the others laughed. Sarah's whole body trembled. Around her, the camp was destroyed. Bodies lay scattered among overturned wagons. Smoke rose in black columns against the blue sky. Of the 42 people who had been traveling together, she counted maybe 15 survivors, all of them women and children, all of them being herded together like cattle. A warrior grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. His grip was iron, unyielding. Sarah tried to pull away, but he yanked her forward, making her cry out. Another warrior brought rope, and they began binding the prisoner's wrists. Sarah's mind raced with terrible possibilities. She had heard stories around campfires, whispered tales of what happened to captives. Some said death was the merciful option. Others spoke of slavery, of being traded between tribes, of never seeing civilization again. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. They marched for hours across the endless prairie. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Sarah's feet blistered in her worn boots. Her wrists burned where the rope cut into her skin. The other captives walked in silence, too terrified or too exhausted to speak. One woman carried her infant, whispering prayers that went unanswered. An older girl, maybe 14, kept looking back toward the destroyed camp as if hoping someone would come to rescue them. But no rescue would come. Sarah knew that with absolute certainty. They were alone, prisoners of people whose language they didn't speak, whose customs they didn't understand, heading toward a fate they couldn't imagine. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah saw their destination. A village of teepees stretched across a river valley, dozens of them arranged in careful circles. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Dogs barked. Children ran between the shelters, playing games that seemed impossibly normal given the horror Sarah had just experienced. The warriors called out, announcing their return, and people emerged from the teepees to see what prizes their men had brought home. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, felt the weight of their stares. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, so utterly lost. This was her new reality now, and she had no idea how to survive it. The village erupted in celebration as the war party returned. Women ululated, their voices rising and falling in waves of sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. Warriors whooped and raised their weapons high. Children danced around the captives, pointing and laughing. Sarah kept her eyes down, focused on her feet, on simply putting one foot in front of the other. If she looked at their faces, if she acknowledged the hatred and triumph she saw there, she might break completely. They were brought to the center of the village, where a large fire burned despite the warm evening. The captives huddled together, 15 terrified souls surrounded by what seemed like hundreds of people. An old woman spat at Sarah's feet. A young warrior walked past and struck one of the men across the face, sending him sprawling. No one helped him up. Sarah's legs threatened to give out, but she forced herself to remain standing. Showing weakness here seemed dangerous, though she had no real idea what showing strength might accomplish. Then the crowd parted, and a man walked through. Sarah looked up despite herself, and her breath caught. He was tall, with long black hair streaked with gray, wearing a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that marked him as someone of great importance. His face was weathered but strong, his eyes sharp and assessing. Unlike the warriors who had captured them, he wore no paint. His presence commanded immediate silence. Even the children stopped their games to watch him approach. This had to be the chief. Sarah had heard that much about native tribes during her journey west. Chiefs held the power of life and death. What he decided would determine everything. The man who had led the attack stepped forward and spoke rapidly in their language, gesturing toward the burning wagon train in the distance, toward the captives, toward the weapons and goods they had taken. The chief listened without expression, his face unreadable. When the warrior finished speaking, the chief walked slowly along the line of captives, studying each one carefully. Sarah felt his gaze land on her, felt him taking in her torn dress, her bleeding wrists, her tangled blonde hair. She wanted to look away but found she couldn't. There was something in his eyes that wasn't cruelty. Intelligence, yes. Power, certainly. But not the savage bloodlust she had expected. He moved on, examining the others, then returned to stand before the entire group. He spoke, and though Sarah didn't understand the words, she understood the authority in his voice. This was a man who had commanded warriors, who had led his people through countless challenges. Whatever he said caused murmurs through the crowd. Some people nodded. Others looked disappointed. The warrior who had captured Sarah argued back, his voice rising in anger. The chief raised one hand, and silence fell immediately. He spoke again, shorter this time, and his tone allowed no argument. A woman approached the captives, an older woman with kind eyes that seemed out of place in this nightmare. She began cutting the ropes that bound their wrists. Sarah gasped as the pressure released, as blood rushed back into her hands. The other captives looked around in confusion and hope. Were they being freed? Was this some kind of trick? The woman said something in broken English, so heavily accented Sarah could barely understand. Chief says you are guests. You will not be harmed. Guests. The word seemed absurd given the circumstances, but Sarah wasn't about to question this stroke of fortune. The woman led them to a teepee at the edge of the village, gesturing for them to enter. Inside, there were buffalo robes spread on the ground, a small fire pit, basic supplies. It was simple but clean. More importantly, they weren't being tortured or killed. The woman brought them water and dried meat, then left them alone. The captives looked at each other in stunned silence. What just happened? Mrs. Henderson finally whispered, clutching her baby close. Why did he spare us? Nobody had an answer. They were alive, at least for now, but they were still prisoners. Sarah lay down on one of the robes, exhausted beyond measure. Her body ached. Her mind reeled with everything she had witnessed. She closed her eyes and tried to make sense of the chief's decision. Why would he show mercy to the people who had invaded his territory? What did he gain from keeping them alive? The night brought no answers, only fitful sleep haunted by images of burning wagons and painted warriors. Sarah woke several times, disoriented and frightened, before remembering where she was. Each time, she heard the sounds of the village outside, people talking, fires crackling, horses nickering softly. Normal sounds of life continuing. It was strange and unsettling to think that while her world had ended, theirs had simply continued as it always had. Morning came with surprising gentleness. The same woman from the night before brought them food, some kind of cornmeal mush and more dried meat. She spoke to them slowly, mixing English words with her own language, helping them understand basic things. Her name was Winona. The chief was called Standing Bear. The warriors who had attacked were Crow, but they had been acting in revenge for an earlier attack by white soldiers. The captives were being allowed to live because Standing Bear believed in honor above all else. He says, Winona explained carefully, that women and children should not suffer for the actions of men they did not control. You did not attack us. The soldiers did. You are not guilty. She paused, choosing her words. But you also cannot leave. Not yet. The warriors are angry. Many lost family to the soldiers. Standing Bear must keep peace in his village. You understand? Sarah nodded slowly. They were alive because of one man's sense of justice, but they were still prisoners because of one man's need to maintain control. It was a precarious position, balanced on the edge of a knife. Everything depended on Standing Bear's continued authority and goodwill. If either faltered, the captives would face the anger of people who had every reason to hate them. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's life took on a rhythm she never could have imagined. Each morning, Winona would bring food and teach them words in Lakota. Sarah learned that Standing Bear's tribe wasn't Crow at all, they were Lakota Sioux, and they had been traveling through Crow territory when they encountered the wagon train. The attack had been led by Crow warriors, but Standing Bear had arrived afterward and taken control of the situation, including the captives. This explained the tension Sarah sometimes felt in the village. Not everyone agreed with the chief's decisions. The other captives struggled in different ways. Mrs. Henderson spent most of her time with her baby, refusing to engage with their captors. The younger girl, Emma, cried herself to sleep every night. The few men who had survived withdrew into bitter silence. But Sarah found herself drawn to understanding these people who held her fate in their hands. She listened to Winona's stories. She watched how the village functioned. She began to see past her fear to the humanity beneath. The Lakota people weren't the savages she had been told about. They were families. Mothers cooked and sewed and worried about their children. Fathers taught their sons to hunt and ride. Elders told stories around fires, preserving history and wisdom. Young people fell in love, argued with their parents, dreamed of the future. They laughed and grieved and celebrated just like anyone else. The realization was both comforting and disturbing. It was easier to hate people when you could think of them as monsters. Standing Bear himself remained an enigma. Sarah saw him often, moving through the village with quiet authority. He settled disputes between villages. He consulted with his council of elders. He spent hours with the young warriors, teaching them things Sarah couldn't understand. But he never spoke directly to the captives. It was as if having made his decision about their fate, he had moved on to other concerns. Sarah found this both frustrating and fascinating. What kind of man could show such mercy to strangers and then seem to forget about them entirely? One afternoon, Sarah was helping Winona gather herbs near the river when they encountered Standing Bear. He was alone, unusual for someone of his status. He stood at the water's edge, staring out across the flowing current with an expression of deep contemplation. Winona started to turn away, clearly intending to give him privacy, but he called out to her in Lakota. She responded, gesturing to Sarah. The chief turned his full attention to the young white woman. "You are learning our language," he said in English, heavily accented but clear. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. He spoke English? All this time, and he had never said a word to them in their own language. "You are surprised," he continued, a slight smile touching his lips. "I learned from a trader many winters ago. It is useful to understand the words of those who wish to take your land." Sarah didn't know what to say. Standing Bear gestured for her to sit on a fallen log nearby. Winona quietly moved away, giving them space. The chief sat as well, his movements graceful despite his age, which Sarah now guessed to be somewhere in his 50s. For a long moment, they sat in silence, listening to the river flow past. "Why did you spare us?" Sarah finally asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Your warriors wanted to kill us. I could see it in their eyes. But you stopped them. Why?" Standing Bear was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. 30 winters ago, I was a young warrior. Hot-blooded and eager to prove myself. We raided a settlement of white families who had built homes on our hunting grounds. We burned their houses. We took their horses. And I. He paused, his jaw tightening. I killed a man who was unarmed. He was trying to protect his wife and children. I did not give him a chance to surrender. I did not show mercy. The chief turned to look at Sarah directly. His wife's face still visits my dreams. The sound of his children crying still echoes in my memory. I have lived with that Dishner for 30 years. I have become chief. I have led my people through war and peace. I have done many things I am proud of. But I cannot undo that moment. I cannot bring back that man or give his family what I took from them. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't what she had expected. She had thought perhaps he would speak of strategy, of politics, of keeping peace in his tribe. She hadn't anticipated genuine remorse, the kind that clearly still weighed on him decades later. When I saw you and the others, Standing Bear continued, I saw that man's family. I saw people who did not choose to invade our lands but were caught in the middle of a war they did not start. The Crow warriors were right to be angry. White soldiers had killed their people just days before. But you were not those soldiers. You were not guilty of their crimes. He stood, his headdress catching the afternoon light. I cannot undo the past. But I can choose honor in the present. That is why you live. He walked away then, leaving Sarah sitting by the river with tears streaming down her face. She had expected a monster and found a man. A man who had done terrible things and carried the weight of them. A man who had power and chose to use it for mercy rather than revenge. For the first time since her capture, Sarah felt something other than fear. She felt the stirrings of respect. That evening, she tried to explain to the other captives what Standing Bear had told her. Most of them didn't want to hear it. They were still too angry, too traumatized by their own losses. Mrs. Henderson turned away, hugging her baby. One of the men spat on the ground. He's still keeping us prisoner, he growled. I don't care about his reasons. But Emma, the young girl, listened with wide eyes. Do you think he'll let us go? She whispered. Eventually? Sarah didn't have an answer. She didn't know what Standing Bear's ultimate plan was for them. But for the first time, she had hoped that their fate might not be sealed in tragedy. The chief was a man of honor, and honor meant something to him. That had to count for something. The first real test came on a scorching afternoon in late summer. Sarah had been in the village for nearly 2 months, long enough that the initial terror had dulled into a constant, manageable anxiety. She had learned to move through the camp without drawing too much attention, to help Winona with daily tasks, to exist in this strange liminal space between prisoner and guest. The other captives had adapted too, each in their own way. Some had even begun learning useful skills, trading labor for better treatment. Everything changed when a group of young warriors returned from a raid with fresh scalps and stories of victory. They had attacked a military supply wagon, killed the soldiers guarding it, and taken weapons and ammunition. The entire village erupted in celebration. Drums pounded late into the night. Warriors danced around the fire, reenacting their triumph. The captives huddled in their teepee, listening to the chaos outside and knowing that this victory would make their position infinitely more dangerous. The next morning, a delegation of warriors came to Standing Bear's teepee. Sarah could hear them from where she sat grinding corn with Winona. Their voices were loud and angry. They wanted blood for blood, justice for the families destroyed by white soldiers. The captives represented that justice. Why should enemies be fed and housed and protected when Lakota children had been killed by white men's bullets? The argument went on for hours, growing more heated as other warriors joined in. Standing Bear emerged from his teepee looking older than Sarah had ever seen him. The weight of leadership sat heavy on his shoulders. He called for a council, and the entire village gathered to hear the debate. Sarah understood enough Lakota now to follow the general argument. The young warriors, fresh from their victory, wanted to prove their strength by killing the captives. Several elders agreed, arguing that keeping prisoners weakened the tribe's position. Only a few voices spoke in defense of Standing Bear's original decision. The chief listened to everyone, his face impassive. When the last person had spoken, he rose. The firelight cast shadows across his weathered features. He began to speak, and though Sarah couldn't catch every word, she understood the essence. He spoke of honor. He spoke of the difference between justice and revenge. He spoke of the kind of people the Lakota were and the kind of people they should aspire to be. He reminded them that their strength came not from cruelty but from their adherence to what was right. Then he did something that made Sarah's heart stop. He walked over to where the captives sat under guard and gestured for Sarah to stand. She rose on shaking legs, certain that this was the end. Standing Bear pulled a knife from his belt. Sarah heard Emma gasp behind her. The crowd murmured with anticipation. But instead of moving toward Sarah, the chief held the knife out to her, handle first. If you wish to leave, he said in English, loud enough for the whole village to hear even though most wouldn't understand the words, I will not stop you. Take this knife for protection. Walk east for 3 days, and you will find a fort. Tell them Standing Bear kept his word. He paused, then added something in Lakota for his people's benefit. Winona whispered a translation to Sarah, he says any warrior who harms you will answer to him personally. Sarah stared at the knife, her mind reeling. This was freedom. After 2 months of captivity, of uncertainty, of living each day not knowing if it would be her last, she was being offered a way out. She could take the knife, take the other captives, and walk away. The warriors might grumble, but they wouldn't dare defy Standing Bear directly. This was her chance. But she didn't take the knife. Sarah didn't fully understand her own reasons. Perhaps it was the memory of Standing Bear's story by the river. Perhaps it was the look in his eyes now, weary and resigned, a man testing whether his faith in mercy had been foolish. Perhaps it was simply that she had seen too much of the Lakota people to believe anymore that they were her enemies. They were people protecting their home, their families, their way of life. The real enemy was the hatred that made white soldiers massacre villages and warriors torture captives. If she took that knife and ran, she would be choosing that hatred. She would be saying that Standing Bear's honor meant nothing. "No," Sarah said quietly. Then louder, so everyone could hear, "No. I will stay." The chief's eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise she had seen from him. Behind her, Mrs. Henderson hissed, "Have you lost your mind?" But Sarah kept her eyes on Standing Bear. "You showed us mercy when you didn't have to," she said. "You protected us when your own people wanted us dead. You gave me your word that we would not be harmed. I'm giving you my word in return. I will stay until you believe it is safe for us to leave. I will not run. I will not betray your trust." Standing Bear stood frozen for a long moment, the knife still extended. Then slowly, he nodded. He turned to his people and spoke in Lakota, and this time his voice carried a different tone. Not defensive or pleading, but strong. Certain. He had proven his point in a way that no words could match. The white woman trusted him more than she feared his warriors. She believed in his honor enough to stake her life on it. The tension broke like a fever. Some warriors still looked angry, but the fire had gone out of their arguments. The elders nodded thoughtfully. A few women actually smiled at Sarah, acknowledging her courage. The council dispersed, and Standing Bear walked away without another word. But Sarah saw something in his posture that hadn't been there before. Not quite relief, but something close to it. Vindication, maybe. Or simply the satisfaction of having his faith in human decency proven right. Winona rushed to Sarah's side, tears streaming down her face. "That was very brave," she said, gripping Sarah's hands. "Very foolish, but very brave. You have made an enemy of some warriors, but you have also made Standing Bear proud. That means more than you know." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about what she had done. The other captives thought she was insane. Mrs. Henderson had actually suggested that the trauma had broken Sarah's mind. Maybe they were right. A smart person would have taken the knife and run. But Sarah had spent 2 months learning that the world wasn't divided into good white people and savage Indians. It was divided into people who chose honor and people who chose hatred. Standing Bear had chosen honor. And now, finally, she had too. The days that followed were strange. The captives were no longer under guard, though they still lived in their designated teepee. They were allowed to move more freely through the village. Some Lakota began treating them less like prisoners and more like unfortunate guests. Winona explained that Sarah's choice had changed something fundamental. "You showed respect," she said. "In our culture, respect is everything. You gave Standing Bear face in front of his warriors. You proved that his wisdom was right. They may not like you, but they must honor the chief's decision now." Autumn arrived with a sudden cold snap that painted the prairie grass gold and red. Sarah had been with the Lakota for nearly 4 months, long enough that her old life felt like a distant dream. She could speak enough Lakota to hold basic conversations. She knew the names of most people in the village. She had learned to tan hides, to identify edible plants, to read weather signs in the clouds. She had learned how to survive in a world completely different from anything she had known. But more importantly, she had learned about the war that was destroying both the Lakota people and the settlers pushing west. Winona and others told her stories that shattered everything Sarah thought she knew. Villages massacred while people slept. Children taken from their families and forced into schools where they were beaten for speaking their own language. Treaties signed and then broken before the ink dried. Starvation on reservations where the government promised food and supplies that never came. The Lakota weren't fighting because they were savage. They were fighting because they were dying, and they had no other choice. Standing Bear called Sarah to his teepee one crisp October morning. She entered nervously, unsure what to expect. The chief sat by his fire, looking thoughtful. He gestured for her to sit across from him. For a long moment, he simply studied her face. Then he spoke in English, which he did more often now with her. "You have changed," he observed. "When you first came here, fear lived in your eyes. Now I see something else. Understanding, perhaps. Or wisdom." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I've learned that nothing is as simple as I believed. I thought this land was empty, waiting for us to claim it. I thought the people here were obstacles to progress. I was wrong about everything." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "And what will you do with this knowledge? When you return to your people?" "Return?" Sarah's heart skipped. You're letting us go? Winter comes soon. If you leave now, you can reach the fort before the snow makes travel impossible. I have delayed as long as I could, until my warrior's anger cooled. It is time. He paused, his eyes searching hers. But you have a choice to make. You can go back to your people and say nothing of what you learned here. You can pretend we are the savages they believe us to be. It would be easier for you. Safer, perhaps. Sarah understood what he was really asking. Or you can tell the truth. You can speak of what you have seen. You can tell them that we are not monsters, that we are people fighting for our homes, our families, our very survival. You can tell them about the promises broken, the children killed, the land stolen. His voice grew heavy. But if you do this, your own people may turn against you. White society does not reward those who speak uncomfortable truths. The weight of the choice settled over Sarah like a physical thing. She thought about her life before, the simple dream she had carried west. She could return to that, or at least try to. She could find a new wagon train, continue to California or Oregon, build the life her father had wanted for her. No one would blame her for keeping silent after what she had been through. But she would blame herself. She would carry the weight of truth unspoken, of injustice unchallenged. She would become complicit in the destruction of people who had shown her mercy when they had every reason not to. Standing Bear had taught her about honor, and honor demanded more than silence. I'll tell the truth, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear. I don't know if anyone will listen. I don't know if it will change anything. But I have to try. Standing Bear smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. You have learned well. This is the courage that matters, not the courage to fight, but the courage to speak when silence would be easier. He reached into a leather bag beside him and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. This is for you. Winona made it. Sarah unfolded the cloth to find a beautiful dress, made from soft deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. Tears sprang to her eyes. It's beautiful, she whispered. You came to us in torn clothes, a prisoner. You leave as a friend, dressed in honor. Standing Bear stood, signaling that the conversation was ending. Tomorrow, I will send 2 warriors to guide you and the others to the fort. They will make sure you arrive safely. After that, your path is your own to walk. That evening was bittersweet. The Lakota held a small ceremony for the departing captives. Sarah wore her new dress, feeling both honored and heartbroken. She had made friends here in this unlikely place. Winona hugged her tightly, whispering blessings in Lakota. Even some of the warriors who had initially wanted them dead nodded respectfully as Sarah passed. She had earned something precious here, not just her freedom, but their respect. The journey to the fort took 3 days, just as Standing Bear had said. The 2 warriors who guided them were young but competent, keeping the group safe from both wild animals and potential threats. When the fort finally came into view, solid and imposing on the horizon, Sarah felt a confusing mix of relief and loss. This was civilization, safety, her own people. But it also meant leaving behind the world she had come to understand. The warriors left them a mile from the fort, disappearing into the prairie as silently as spirits. The captives walked the final distance alone, a bedraggled group that drew immediate attention from the soldiers at the gate. Within minutes, they were surrounded by uniformed men asking questions, by medical staff checking for injuries, by officers demanding to know what had happened to their wagon train. Sarah told her story, but she told all of it. She spoke of the attack, yes, but also of Standing Bear's mercy. She described the Lakota village not as a savage camp but as a community of families. She explained about the broken treaties, the massacred villages, the desperate fight for survival. She watched the faces around her change from sympathetic to uncomfortable to hostile. Sounds like you became an Indian lover, one officer said coldly. Maybe we should have left you with them. But Sarah didn't back down. Over the following weeks, as the captives were processed and prepared for their journey to proper settlements, she continued to speak truth to anyone who would listen. Most didn't want to hear it. Some called her a traitor. Others suggested the trauma had damaged her mind. Mrs. Henderson and the other captives distanced themselves from her, wanting only to forget their ordeal and return to normal life. Only Emma, the young girl, sought Sarah out one evening. I believe you, she said quietly. About Standing Bear, about everything. I saw it too. They weren't monsters. They were just people. Sarah squeezed the girl's hand, grateful for this small validation. Remember that, she said. When you're older, when you hear people talk about the Indian wars, remember what you saw. Remember that it's more complicated than heroes and villains. Remember that honor exists on both sides, and so does evil. 6 months later, Sarah found herself in Denver, working as a seamstress and writing letters to newspapers about what she had experienced. Most were never published. Those that were drew angry responses calling her naive, misguided, or worse. But slowly, gradually, a few people began to listen. A few voices joined hers in questioning the official narrative of savage Indians and civilized settlers. It wasn't much, but it was something. She never saw Standing Bear again, but she heard news of the Lakota people. She heard about their continued resistance, their eventual confinement to reservations, the slow destruction of their way of life. Each piece of news felt like a personal wound. She had been given a gift of understanding, and with it came the burden of watching injustice unfold while being powerless to stop it. But she never stopped speaking. She told her story at churches, at social gatherings, in letters and articles and anywhere people would listen. She spoke of a Lakota chief who chose honor over revenge, who valued mercy more than vengeance, who proved that humanity could exist even in the midst of war. She spoke of her transformation from fear to understanding, from hatred to respect, from ignorance to truth. Years later, an elderly Lakota woman would find Sarah and give her a message. Standing Bear had died peacefully, surrounded by family, still honored by his people. Before his death, he had spoken of the white woman who chose to stay when she could have fled, who honored his honor with her own. Tell her, he had said, that she kept her word. And in doing so, she proved that peace between our peoples was possible, even if others would not allow it to last. Sarah wept when she heard this, not from sadness but from gratitude. She had been saved by Standing Bear's honor, but in the end, they had saved each other. He had given her life, and she had given his choice meaning. In a world bent on war and destruction, they had created a small moment of understanding. It hadn't changed the outcome of history, but it had changed two people, and perhaps that was enough. She spent the rest of her life telling this story, hoping that somewhere, someone would hear it and choose honor over hatred, understanding over fear, truth over comfortable lies. And though the Indian wars would rage on, though Standing Bear's people would suffer unimaginable losses, though the world seemed determined to forget the humanity of those it conquered, Sarah's story persisted. A testament to one chief's courage, one woman's transformation, and the possibility of finding freedom not from captivity, but from the chains of ignorance and hate.